You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or, Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for November 3rd, 2023. This week, tricuspid regurgitation therapy, 2 more left atrial appendage occlusion trials, and I want to do some reflection on perhaps being too soft. Before I say anything this week, recall that AHA is coming up. There's going to be big trials coming, and I will do a bit of preview next week. We'll have artesia in subclinical AF, semaglutide in obesity, dapagliflozin after MI, and the ultimate test of PCI, which is Orbita 2, so stay tuned next week. This week I'm going to cover 3 trials, and then I want to do a little thinking about some very tough criticism that I received this week. First topic is tricuspid regurgitation and TRILUMINATE. At the TCT meeting in San Francisco, tricuspid regurgitation did come up. Now, severe TR, tricuspid regurg, is common. It's super common when echocardiograms are done while patients are fluid overloaded. The question with TR is always about the cause, whereas mitral regurgitation can be primary due to diseases like flail leaflets, or secondary MR due to a dilated annulus and LV dysfunction. TR is almost always secondary. In other words, it's due to the underlying conditions leading to the RV dilatation. The thing with TR is you can see it. It's so colorful. The Doppler of that regurgitant jet displays these big, bright colors. Doctors are then tempted to think, ouch, that is bad. We can fix that. Surely fixing it will help this patient. The problem until recently was that the fix for TR required surgery, and that had a very high complication and death rate, so mostly people left it alone, which turns out to be fine because it's most often treated by treating the things that dilate the RV, the upstream things. But now we have clipping devices, clips similar to the mitral clip, so there is temptation. The temptation to do transcutaneous edge-to-edge repair, or TEER, the temptation to do that is now immense. And I do keep an open mind about this procedure. If TER of the tricuspid valve worked, I'd embrace it. I love stuff that fixes people. Of course, the only way to know if it helps people is a proper trial. And by proper, I mean it would have to have blinding and endpoints that were resistant to bias, like any interventional trial, say stroke or death after TAVI or surgery. Sadly, the major trial for transcutaneous edge-to-edge repair, called TRILUMINATE, does not do such things. I've reported previously on TRILUMINATE when it came out in March at ACC, but it is in news again because at TCT, trial authors presented a study extension focusing on the most biased aspect of TRILUMINATE, that is, the quality of life aspect. Now, here's a brief recap. In TRILUMINATE, the original trial in New England Journal of Medicine had about 350 patients with severe TR randomized to have the procedure or tablets, that is, no procedure. The endpoint was a hierarchical endpoint with death or tricuspid valve surgery as the first endpoint, heart failure hospitalization, or, wait for it, quality of life as measured by the KCCQ. Now, they used the win ratio, and of course the trial was positive, but there was no difference in death or tricuspid valve surgery or heart failure hospitalization. The driver of the positive trial was quality of life. Now, gosh, this boggles my mind that they measured patient-reported quality of life in a trial when one group got no procedure, so-called subtraction anxiety, and the other group got a big procedure, so-called faith healing. Yet there the trial sits in the New England Journal of Medicine. It cited its driving enthusiasm to clip the tricuspid valve. At TCT meeting, Dr. David Adams, a TRILUMINATE author, presented TRILUMINATE Pivotal, which were outcomes of all the randomized patients, some extra patients, plus a single-arm sub-study. This was in a late-breaking clinical science session at the meeting. The report included more than 200 extra patients randomized, as well as 100 patients from a single-arm part of the trial. The follow-up was about a year. Again, they found no difference in mortality of tricuspid valve surgery or heart failure hospitalizations. But of course, there were still better results on the KCCQ, similar to the main trial. The authors also noted in this larger cohort a now statistically significant improvement in the 6-minute walk test. That was a difference from the main trial where the results of the 6-minute walk test did not reach statistical significance. They also reported results of 100 patients enrolled in a single-arm part of the trial. These were older patients more likely to have cardiac leads and just a higher risk patient. In that population, they found that the procedure outcomes were similar to that in the RCT, and mainly they could reduce tricuspid regurgitation and they could do the procedure at a low complication rate. The extra data is not yet published, but it was discussed at the meeting. Here are some comments from Adams, a senior author, and some panelists who are also key opinion leaders in this space. Dr. Adams felt that this data strengthened the conclusions of the original trial, but he did question out loud, actually, whether the procedure was actually helping people was a difficult question to answer because of the lack of a sham control. But he quickly pivoted to, quote, "We have to rely on the safety of the procedure. So is it really a bad thing to offer a procedure that might help if a patient is symptomatic?" Tricuspid valve clips, he mentioned, was not about increasing lifespan, but getting patients to feel better and have less heart failure. Now, my comments about this. Everything about this tricuspid valve space worries me. It worries me specifically about treating right heart failure in patients with TR, but it also worries me about our approach to medical science. TRILUMINATE was planned and it was conducted, and I know that the authors know that a subjective endpoint such as KCCQ is basically worthless in an unblinded trial. But they did it anyways. I don't know, perhaps in consultation with the FDA, which would be extremely depressing if FDA was involved in this. Now, if you think that tricuspid edge-to-edge repair is beneficial, then I think it's on you to select the patients you think could benefit and then enroll them in a blinded trial. You need a sham procedure, which is totally doable. Come on, a sham tricuspid valve clipping trial would be 10 times easier than an orbital-like trial where a serious coronary lesion is left unstented. Now, even if TRILUMINATE reported a reduction in something like heart failure hospitalizations, I think it would still be fraught because of the lack of blinding. TRILUMINATE data is going to go to the FDA, and I think it should be a no-brainer that this procedure should not be approved. At TCT, there was also a report of a percutaneous tricuspid valve replacement, and this was very early on. Results were decent, but the same comments apply, right? If you think this helps, you've got to do a proper sham-controlled trial with hard clinical endpoints. Finally, let my final comment about this be that no interventional cardiologist should ever entrap a right ventricular pacing lead without discussion first with an electrophysiologist. This is a real problem because these leads cannot then be extracted. Now, this podcast tries not to be cynical, and I'll make some comments at the end regarding the medical science issues. Next two topics will regard two trials with percutaneous left atrial appendage occlusion, both presented at TCT and published. Now, Swiss Apero is an RCT comparing left atrial appendage closure with two different types of percutaneous closure devices. One's called Amulet, the other's Watchman. They're made by two different companies. All you need to know for this is that they are both market leaders and they have different technical aspects. Both have the same goal, though. The main goal is to physically close off the left atrial appendage so clots cannot form in there. The primary endpoint of the original trial, Swiss Apero, was which was published in Circulation in 2022. First author, Roberto Galea. This was a composite of procedural switching to a different device, sort of a procedural success endpoint, and the second primary endpoint was residual patency of the appendage assessed by CT scan at 45 days. The main trial results was somewhat of a wash. There were 221 patients. The endpoint was reached in 67 versus 70%, so no real difference. There were some subtleties between the two devices, but no definitive conclusions could be made about the merits of the specific devices. Well, at TCT, we heard one-year outcomes, and it's sobering. Circ has published the data in a research letter form. All right, sit down for this, the results. Patency of the left atrial appendage was observed in 54% of patients with amulet and 49% of patients with Watchman. Pause there. The numbers can numb you, but let me translate. In a trial with expert operators who were surely proponents for the procedure, successful closure of the appendage occurred in only half the patients with either device. Half. Gosh. Now, I want to insert some background and nuance here. If you partially close an appendage, things can be worse. That is because a small jet into or out of the appendage creates turbulence, and studies have shown that that increases clotting. Indeed, peri-device leaks with the Watchman device have associated with higher stroke rates. In the LAOS 3 trial, this was a surgical appendage closure trial at the time of heart surgery for some other reason. The primary investigator, Richard Whitlock, aggressively educated surgeons in the trial that the technique was key, mainly that there should be no partial closures of the appendage. Now here in Swiss Apero, we have half the patients with either device have leaks. So even if you believe that left atrial appendage closure is a reasonable stroke strategy, percutaneous closure ain't getting it done. Now, I know proponents will counter my take here as saying that Swiss Apero investigators use CT scans to assess patency, and this may be more sensitive than transesophageal echo, which is the more accepted approach, and maybe that is true. But contrast in the appendage on a CT scan is contrast in the appendage, and it had to get there somehow via a leak. Now, if you don't believe my negative take on this, listen to Vivek Reddy, who's commented publicly on the matter of CT being too sensitive versus transesophageal echo. He said, quote, "My guess is they'll be very similar and they both bad." So in some ways, I guess you could look at this as a little disappointing and depressing because that means we have a lot of leaks. Now, since the very beginning of the percutaneous appendage saga, going back to the primary data, PREVAIL and PROTECT, this sort of data has always been there. Ischemic strokes, that is clots, the outcome which this device is supposed to prevent, have been higher in the device arm versus the warfarin arm. My friends, this is a trial comparing the two devices. Neither of them looked very different, but instead the whole percutaneous left atrial appendage endeavor looks dubious. Do not look away from this data. All right, next trial, watch TAVR trial. Also at TCT and published in Circulation was the Watch TAVR trial. This was a Boston Scientific funded RCT looking at the addition of appendage closure with Watchman to TAVI. About 170 patients got TAVI plus left atrial appendage closure, and 170 patients got TAVI alone. Patients were average age 81, all had AFib, about half of them paroxysmal. Mean CHA2DS2-VASc score of these patients was 4.9. Now, the idea behind the trial is debatable. The stated thinking is that patients who have aortic stenosis and AFib have a high risk of stroke and bleeding. Many of these patients don't continue their oral anticoagulation after TAVI, and so the left atrial appendage occlusion could help reduce both stroke and bleeding. Emphasis on could. And, of course, since the operators already have a patient on the table and they're working on this patient, adding another procedure is certainly less than doing it later as a sequential procedure. Now, when I add my comments, I will propose another idea behind the trial. But let me first mention the analysis plan, and it is very dubious. They analyzed the primary outcome with non-inferiority. The primary outcome was stroke, death, or major bleeding at 2 years. Now, I say dubious for multiple reasons. One reason is that non-inferiority usually tests a less invasive, less costly, less risky procedure against the standard. If a procedure has an advantage, like it's less risky or it's less invasive, then you'll tolerate some degree of inferiority. I would argue that TAVI plus left atrial appendage closure, though, is actually the more aggressive, invasive, and risky procedure. Now, I'm going to quote their argument for doing non-inferiority. They write that the non-inferiority design was planned based on the hypothesis that the appendage closure will be safer, less bleeding, and less cost related to monitoring of anticoagulation, bleeding event management in this elderly patient population, or get this sequential procedure of appendage closure, and of course patients' convenience of avoiding 2 procedures or lifetime anticoagulation. My friends, I find this so problematic. First, we already know the pivotal Holmes meta-analysis of PROTECT and PREVAIL, and I'll link to it, showed no difference in bleeding. There is no compelling data suggesting that appendage closure reduces bleeding versus any kind of anticoagulation if you count the procedure. Their second contention is that doing appendage closure at the time of TAVI would be more convenient than a sequential procedure of appendage closure. But that is circular logic, because what data supports doing a subsequent appendage closure in an octogenarian who is status post-TAVI? The answer, of course, is none. But these weren't even the worst problems with the non-inferiority design. The worst problem is that here, non-inferiority design is set up to achieve non-inferiority because they have added endpoints expected to go in different directions. This is like breaking non-inferiority rule number 1. Here's what I mean. You're supposed to test left atrial appendage closure as non-inferiority to oral anticoagulation for stroke or death prevention. That's the efficacy endpoint. Then you study bleeding as the safety endpoint. That endpoint should be a superiority test. This was just like the DOAC versus the warfarin trials. This is the proper way of testing, because if there is not superiority of bleeding with the appendage closure, you would accept no degree of inferiority in stroke prevention. But that is not what they did. Having stroke and bleeding in the endpoint leads to balance. Balance because stroke and bleeding are expected to go in different directions. And when you have balance, when you balance the composite endpoint, you get no difference. And remember that in non-inferiority, no difference is the positive finding. This was actually the fatal flaw in the Prague 17 trial, which was appendage closure versus DOACs. And this is basically what they found. The primary endpoint was 22.7 events per 100 patient years in the combination TAVI plus appendage arm versus 27.3 per 100 patient years in the TAVI alone or plus medicine arm. The hazard ratio for the primary endpoint was 0.86, and the upper bound was 1.22, and since the upper bound of 1.22, 22% worse, was less than the declared non-inferiority margin of 1.5, then non-inferiority was met. They did not report any difference in the individual endpoints, or significant difference, I should say. Bleeding, for instance, was 12.9 versus 12.3 per 100 patient years. So adding Watchman and reducing anticoagulants did not reduce bleeding, and that's just like every other previous trial. Procedure-wise, there were 4 additional pericardial effusions in the appendage occlusion arm. There was also 5 times more arterial and venous thrombosis or embolisms in the appendage arm. The authors concluded that, quote, concomitant Watchman left atrial appendage occlusion and TAVI is not inferior to TAVI with medical therapy in severe aortic stenosis with patients with AFib. But the increased complexity and risks of the combined procedure should be considered when concomitant appendage occlusion is viewed as an alternative to medical therapy for patients with AFib who are having TAVI. All right, my comments. Now, the top-line results surely don't support adding appendage occlusion to TAVI. There was no difference in bleeding, there was no difference in stroke, and there was added complexity of the procedure, and there were more perforations and more clots, arterial and venous clots. So no, please, TAVI friends, don't think of closing the appendage percutaneously like the surgeons did in LAOS 3. When surgeons close the appendage openly at the time of heart surgery, they do so epicardially and completely without a foreign body. And LAOS 3 showed significant reductions in stroke, but this is different. The results of watched TAVI could also have been predicted, right? An older patient who has aortic valve replacement is surely the least likely person to benefit from a focal stroke reduction procedure like left atrial appendage occlusion. Even, my friends, even if you thought appendage occlusion worked. I don't think it works, and of course the previous study I covered, the Swiss ABRO study, showed that it doesn't actually work to close the appendage half the time. So why do I say, why are TAVI patients least likely to benefit from appendage occlusion? That's because they have oodles of competing risks of stroke. Octogenarians can have stroke from many causes. AFib-related stroke is only one of the small causes of stroke in an older patient. Plus, in TAVI, think about it. You are dragging large catheters around the aortic arch, then crushing a calcific aortic valve. That is a lot of competing risk of stroke. All right, next topic is some thoughts on medical science. And these trials lead me to this more serious issue. And I want to say that this week I took some serious criticism from a colleague in academics. This is a colleague I respect a lot. He said that I go after soft targets on This Week in Cardiology. He said that soft targets are fine, but the real corruption goes past me every week. And this is really hard. He pointed out my conflicts. I might be doing this, he added, because of my conflicts. That is, people ask me to speak and they pay for my travel, and this is nice, and if I went harder with my criticism, then I might lose this benefit. Gosh. My colleague thinks the academy is broken, and he thinks that it is not good-natured for me to be as naive as I am. And of course, this made me think a lot. Of course, I am not inside the gates of the academy. I'm out here looking in. I am not on trial conference calls. I don't get asked about planning these trials. I never meet with industry. I approach medical science as a user of the evidence. And truthfully, more often than not, I find reasons to either A, be very cautious about the evidence and the author's outsized conclusions, or B, it leads me to really question the scientific process. So the Watch TAVR trial is one of those that tempt me to be cynical. Why would this trial be done? A different colleague suggested by email that this trial was about marketing. This is an electrophysiologist, and he wrote to me by email, quote, "I do seriously believe that the true purpose of this trial is to tap a new market for the device, the TAVR operators. I think it might be a good strategy. It's kind of out of the box. When we think of new markets, we usually think of new patients and new indications, but rarely do we think of convincing new or other specialists." Oh, my friends, I don't want to go to this place. I don't want to be cynical. For instance, I went to Denmark and Norway this year, and I saw young people, young scientists striving to discover things through science, and it was refreshing. It seemed very pure. Also, I have to say, my patients have benefited greatly from innovation in electrophysiology over the decades. I mean, ablations used to take 5 hours. Now they take 1 hour. That's because of innovation. So I am not against progress. I love progress. We've made great progress. But this trial, come on. The author surely knew that non-inferiority testing this endpoint is totally bonkers. But they did it anyways. Circulation lets them get away with it. And the study got news coverage. Now, it almost doesn't matter what the results are, right? Because young people see big people doing this, and they think, well, if appendage occlusion is being studied in addition to TAVI, appendage occlusion must be great. Now, the trialists surely knew that these are the least likely patients to benefit from appendage occlusion because of all their competing risks, but they did it anyways. Then, what about TRILUMINATE investigators? Now, come on, they focus on quality of life in an unblinded trial. What am I supposed to think about that? These are high-level people who knew that this is a broken science, but they did it anyways. It's in New England Journal of Medicine. And now we hear more sub-studies presented at national meetings. A sham would have been easy to do in TRILUMINATE. You just add a sham procedure, or simply add more patients and you could power a trial for outcomes. Now that sponsor surely has the money for a properly powered trial. So, in conclusion, how do I or you adjust your trust measure? I am asking, are my colleagues correct about science being this broken? The thing about trust is really precarious, right? I mean, take it back to the clinic. A doctor could recommend 10 things. 9 of the 10 could be spot on. Exercise, diet, sleep. But if that doctor recommends something foolish, even one foolish thing, we lose trust in that doctor. So that's my struggle with these broken studies. When a study is obviously designed to favor a new and lucrative procedure, how am I supposed to feel about the scientific process? I am asking. Please let me know about this. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, next week is AHA Review. If you like this podcast, please take the time, give us a rating, write us a 1 or 2 sentence review. I really do look at the feedback and I appreciate it. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.